It's like the closer you
Yeah.
look, the blurrier it gets, you know? It's like
Yeah.
those paintings that are made of dots, and when you're standing far away, it looks like a picture. And then
Mhm.
the closer you get, it just turns into a big sea of dots.
Yep.
That's what gender is. A big
That's
sea of
it.
dots.
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex, and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, mental health and kink, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. Come with us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance, and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I identify as a cisgender woman, and my pronouns are she and her. In this episode, I have a conversation with CASSIAN LODGE, who started the Gender Census in 2011. You can still take part in this year's Gender Census until the 10th of March at least. Visit smartsurvey.co.uk/s/Gender Census 2021 or click the link to take part on the gendercensus.com website. CASSIAN's pronouns are they, them, and they identify as non-binary and agender. Find out what that means to CASSIAN in this episode. We also talk about finding gender inside, or not, navigating public toilets, passion and experience versus education, the overlap between gender identity and sexual orientation, finding common ground where there appears to be only contradiction and conflict, and microactivism, how small actions can have a big impact. To clarify some terminology that is used in the episode, mix is how the gender-neutral title MX is pronounced. It was recorded on the 23rd of February 2021. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
Oh, Cassian.
Hello, Cassian. And how do you identify?
I sort of broadly put myself under the non-binary umbrella because I'm not a man or a woman. I've never really been able to find any gender in me. So I kind of mostly, like, if somebody wants a single word, then I'll just go with agender. But like, I mean, there's just nothing there. So
There's nothing there.
yeah,
That's so fascinating.
I'm
You
just
say
just
you've
nothing.
never found a gender in you. That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, how is that? Have you always felt that way? And how did that
Yeah.
show up for you?
I
Yeah.
mean, I guess I've always assumed that nobody can find any gender when they look, right? Like, is that normal? What do you see when you look inside yourself for gender? Like, how do you know?
See, that's a very good question. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
No.
But you
Hmm.
but you settle on woman more or less, right?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because
And
of social and social conditioning and upbringing, I guess, and because of
right.
biology, and it's a summary of various things, isn't it,
I
the
see.
woman thing.
Okay.
Yeah, for me, I guess. For some people, the ability to procreate is very much part of being a woman.
Mm-hmm.
For me, not really, because I don't have kids and I don't want any and never have.
Mm.
So so it does vary a lot for people. So, and there's lots of facets to it, but it's a really tricky question. Actually, I was a bit like,
Yeah.
what?
So
If you look
like
inside for a gender, like what is? And I'm like, oh my goodness, I don't
so
know.
if we both like look internally for some gender and we can't find any,
Yeah.
and somehow I've concluded that I'm like nothing, and you've
Uh-huh.
concluded that you're kind of cis queer womanish,
Yeah.
like how what happened there, you know?
Yeah. Right. Oh my goodness, what did
um,
happen there?
yeah,
Hmm.
I don't know, but like I guess like I've had a bunch of gender dysphoria type things that have happened, like wanting to have top surgery, wanting to have hysterectomy, things like that,
Hmm.
like wanting to
Hmm.
remove the parts of myself that get me assigned female.
Hmm.
So that's probably like, if it wasn't for those things, then I might, if I wasn't uncomfortable at all, then I probably wouldn't have really noticed that I didn't have a gender, you know?
Mm. Yeah.
So maybe I'm just you, but with extra gender dysphoria.
Maybe. Yeah.
I don't
Wow.
know.
I just feel like my mind's blown. I'm just, I have to gather it now. Like, what? What?
Oh,
Wow. In a good way. In a good way. It's
cool.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Wow. Yeah. So you've kind of just explained what non-binary and agender means to you.
I guess so,
I
yeah.
guess. Yeah. Hello, cat. Little
Oh,
cat bell. Oh.
took like 2 minutes for her to interrupt the podcast.
That's pretty good going. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
go to
It's
sleep
all
on my
good
lap.
though. Cats are always allowed to, take part. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
that's good
it's it's
then.
acceptable. It's totally acceptable. Yeah.
Oh, she's invited.
Yes, she is.
Yeah, so my
Yeah.
gender, what it means to me is it's not really there. When
Mhm.
I say it, it's like there isn't even an it to refer to. Like it's just, I'm just not,
Mm.
there's just nothing there, you know?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. I think it's something that we probably don't even think about, like the way we're brought up and stuff. It's just like, yeah, it's all about fitting in, I think. We all fit into this society and we conform to the way things work,
Yeah, you
and
kind of
don't
have
really
to find a
fit in them at
space.
all. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, for me, because my biology and identity don't clash, I can't, I don't have dysphoria in the way that I've heard people describe that.
Mm,
So, yeah, so that there's probably something in that. Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. So now I have to think of something else to ask you. I'm like, okay, my brain is just like, I'm sitting here like a rabbit in the headlights thinking, oh my God, I've looked inside and there's no gender there. What if oh my goodness. So,
Maybe we should stop and come back to this in a couple of years when you've like had a while to think about it.
oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah. This is something I'll be processing though. It's very
Yeah.
interesting. It is such an interesting perspective. Yeah, how would you say this has showed up throughout your life? Have you always related to the labels of non-binary and agender? Okay, I guess it also kind of
Mm.
depends on how old you are and when those terms came into your experience, I
Yeah.
guess.
I mean, when I was a child, I guess like I didn't really relate to what it means to be a girl or a boy. And yeah, when I was a child, I didn't really understand why various things were connected with like girlhood or boyhood. And
Mm.
I guess like anybody who is aware of sexism and misogyny would probably be able to identify that like any child who was assigned female at birth would very legitimately get very upset with a gender system being applied to them, whether they like it or not, saying you can do this, you can't do that, you can feel this, you can't feel that. But for me, it was just like anything that anybody tried to apply to me in terms of like gendered anything just didn't stick. Like
Mm.
Teflon. I just it just wouldn't work. Like I I did I wanted to connect with things that I was interested in, that I was curious about, that I was passionate about. And as far as I could see, the gender system was kind of irrelevant to anything about like who I felt I was as a person.
Mm.
But because nobody told me that trans people were a thing or that non-binary people were a thing, I had no idea. I just assumed that everybody felt that way. Like I just assumed that all the girls were annoyed with having to be girls and all the boys were annoyed with having to be boys. When I found out that trans people existed, it was just kind of like sensationalist pieces in the news or in TV shows or on talk shows or whatever about fictional trans women who were just cisgender men wearing dresses and lipstick, you know? So
Mm.
when I found out what trans people were, I didn't identify with anything that I saw. So it didn't occur to me that I might be trans as well. And the whole time I was trying to work out what my sexual orientation was because I couldn't find any of that either. And that, like, I
Did you
wanted,
look everywhere though? Like, did you look in all the
yeah,
places?
like the back of the cupboard, down the back of the sofa. I looked everywhere and couldn't find any sexual orientation. Yeah,
Ah,
so
ah.
but I still carried on looking anyway because I had worked out that I wasn't trans, so obviously it must be something to do with my sexuality, the reason why I felt like an alien. And since then, the number of reasons why I felt like an alien have just been stacking up. The list keeps getting longer. But the first thing that I bumped into that I tried to work out was sexual orientation, and I tried bisexual, and that didn't work. And I tried queer, and that worked a bit better because it was extremely vague. And
Mm.
like, now that I look back on it, it's because queer is so vague that gender could potentially be part of that as well.
Mm. Yeah.
And then when I was 24, and I was on Twitter and I was tweeting about it, and a friend of mine said, "You should join Tumblr. That's where all the genderly interesting people are." So I was like, okay, let's try Tumblr. And I found out that there were people out there who were not trans men who wanted to have top surgery, and that was just okay. And all of a sudden, everything just kind of fell into place, like. So
Oh.
it was like, first of all, oh my God, I didn't realize before, but I don't want breasts and I'm allowed to get rid of them. Like,
Mm.
I just assumed that I was stuck with them and therefore hadn't even considered that maybe I didn't want them. So suddenly I knew that I could get rid of them and that I didn't want them. Therefore, it was like, yes, this is the one thing that I want in the world right now.
Mm.
And then when I looked into the kinds of people who were having top surgery but weren't trans men, it was like, so these people are like genderqueer or non-binary. And it, like 2 or 3 years earlier than that, a friend of mine had given me a copy of Genderqueer by Ricky Wilchins, sort of in a kind of a hint way. And I read it all and was like, wow, this is really, really interesting. And then I put it down and didn't look at it again. So I didn't take the hint at all, which contributes to another of the ways that I am an alien in, the autistic way. But yeah, so I didn't take that hint. And then years later, joined Tumblr, found out that you could want to get rid of your breasts and that you might be able to get rid of your breasts. If you weren't a trans man but you wanted to get rid of your breasts, maybe you are genderqueer or non-binary. So I posted like, hey, I think I might be non-binary or genderqueer or something, but like, I don't feel like I'm a third gender or bi-gender or anything like that. Like, I just feel like I haven't got any gender. And somebody was like, maybe you're agender. The word for having no gender is agender. And I was like, oh, there's a word for it. And like, basically, having words for things is the thing that makes my brain be able to conceptualize things and identify with things. So
Mm.
I guess I'm quite a linguistically oriented person. Like, if I haven't got words for something, then I just don't understand it. So having the words genderqueer, non-binary meaning beyond or outside of or transcending the gender binary of everybody is entirely, completely, all the time male or entirely, completely, all the time female. Like, if I don't fit that, then that means I'm non-binary. So that kind
Mm.
of made sense to my brain.
Mm.
And then having a word for the specific type of non-binary that I am kind of made me feel like I had a place within this really, really broad, really fuzzy group. So a lot of trans people talk about their self-discovery process like as if it took a really long time. And obviously there were a lot of steps for me that happened before finding out what non-binary was that probably should have given me clues that something was going on with my gender. But I was honestly completely oblivious until I found out that non-binary was a thing and agender was a thing. And then it suddenly was like, it took me about a week to come to terms with it. I went from like thinking I was a cisgender woman to thinking that I was non-binary and agender and feeling comfortable with it in about a week. And then
Mm.
nothing has changed since then. It's just been incredibly consistent. So,
Mm.
and trans people talk about having doubts, and like there's going to be, everybody has points at various stages of the transition where they think, what if I'm wrong about who I am or something, and it just
Mm.
has never happened to me. Like, there's never been any fluctuation. Occasionally I explore an idea like, oh, maybe I'm just a trans man, and then I imagine like using only men's toilets in public, or if I go to the gym, using the men's changing rooms, and I'm like, oh no, that no. And it's exactly the same feeling as I feel about like using exclusively women's toilets in public or using women's changing rooms. Like, there's there is no gender that feels like home to me.
Mm.
So I just don't bother. It just, I sometimes try to apply a gender and it doesn't stick, and then I carry on.
Yeah, Teflon maybe is a gender like in itself,
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
fair. Yeah. That's interesting how you mentioned about the, changing rooms and toilets and stuff in public.
Mm.
So do you just go with the flow of the mood, like which one you use? Do you try and use like neutral ones if they're there? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I guess like because I have physical disabilities, so as long as there's not anybody around who's obviously in greater need than me, then I'll use the disabled toilets if that's the only gender neutral option.
Hmm.
But sometimes I will just use whichever toilet is closer. I went through a phase of like asking whoever I was with at the time whether they thought I looked like I belonged in the men's or the women's toilets and just use whichever one they said. But after a while of doing that, I found that women's toilets have nicer soap and men's toilets smell bad. So
They
I
do.
have more or less settled on using women's toilets if there are only gendered options available, just because the soap is nicer and it smells better.
Because practical. Yeah,
Yeah.
I know what you mean.
But
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes
Because
whichever is closer, or whichever one has a shorter queue, that's a good one as well.
see that I have used the men's room as well when when there's been a massive queue. I don't care, but it, like you say, it does like makes you go ew.
Yeah.
It doesn't smell as good. I mean, does a
I
toilet
don't
even smell good?
understand why people don't look after the men's toilets as much as they look after the women's
Right?
toilets. Like, you have cleaners, they have to go in every however many hours. Are they
Yeah.
just skipping the men's toilets because men are slobs? That doesn't seem right. Like,
Right.
I mean, like, surely men are not slobs to that extent, Like, just
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
men doesn't explain how manky the toilets are. Explain yourselves. I just, these are
Right.
the things we have to deal with as trans people.
Right. And what makes me laugh as well, I saw this meme the other day, and it said something about people who object to gender neutral toilets. It's like you've got one at home,
Yes.
It's like
I kind of understand the thing where people are objecting with having to share with people of a different gender. Like, gender neutral toilets, I would love them and I would absolutely be fine with sharing with men and women. That would be completely okay. But at the same time, because of the thing where women have nicer smelling soap and men's toilets smell really bad, I can understand why, for example, women might not want to share with men.
that does make sense. Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
there are like various religions that say that women aren't allowed to share with men or something. So yeah,
Yeah.
basically, like, I don't want to make all toilets gender neutral. I don't think that
Mm,
people who object to gender neutral toilets everywhere are being silly.
mm,
Like, there is a difference between having a gender neutral toilet in your house and going to a gender neutral toilet in public, because
mhm.
random members of the public don't use your toilet at home, right?
That's
Like,
fair. Yeah, that's
it,
true.
and And I think for most people, whether or not you're sharing with men isn't the issue that gender critical people complain about all the time, which is like men using the same space as women will take advantage of that to abuse women. Like, I don't
Mm,
think that people object to gender neutral toilets on those grounds most of the time. I think they just feel a bit uncomfortable with the idea of sharing a toilet with a different gender for
mm,
whatever, just like they just feel it, they
mm,
just feel
mhm.
uncomfortable.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and I feel like maybe that's all right, like, I don't think that we should make everything gender neutral. I think we should have men's toilets, women's toilets, disabled toilets, and gender neutral toilets.
Totally. Yeah, have a choice. Yeah, yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I can relate to that in a way because when I have used like the men's toilets, it does smell bad, worse than
Yeah,
the women's. And also it makes me not want to touch anything, and it just makes me feel a
yeah,
bit like ew. And yeah, so totally. I don't want all the toilets or the only toilets I have access to when I'm out and about to be like that. Of
yeah.
course not. No. I want the nice smelling soapy toilets, please.
Yes,
Yeah.
put nice soap in the men's toilets and then I'll be happy,
Yeah.
basically.
Mhm. Well, we've sorted that out, so that's all
Yeah.
solved now. That's brilliant.
Yeah,
So, yeah, so you run the Gender Census.
I do.
What made you get into that? How did that all start?
I'm just I'm very curious. I'm powered by curiosity. And people, when I found out what non-binary was, it was 10 years ago now. So that would be 2011. And having been sort of like floating about in the non-binary communities online for a couple of years, I basically identified that nobody really kind of knew what they were talking about. Uh, I mean, specifically, like they were saying things like, yeah, well, I mean, everybody who doesn't identify as a man or woman is genderqueer. Or obviously, the most popular pronoun that isn't he or she is Z here. And that's been around for 20 years and it's very well established, and we should all use that. And just sort of making unfounded assertions that were not really based on anything current or like broad in scope. So anytime anybody made a statement like that, I would be like, well, how do you know? Where have you got this information from? And
Mm.
it was always like, well, most of the non-binary people I've talked to, blah 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 blah. I'm like, well, I mean, that's not really good enough, is it? So I decided to knock together a really, really basic Google form. I had no idea what I was doing, and put a few questions in that were very badly phrased, and asked on Twitter, like, if I was going to do a survey asking for people's gender identity, what kind of checkbox options do you think you would expect to see? And just added everything that everybody said as a checkbox option, and asked about titles and pronouns. And I think there were a couple of other questions as well. And I just posted the link to the Google form on my personal Twitter. And I was just like, if I get a few responses, I'll write up a blog post afterwards with some nice graphs in, just, show you all what I found out basically. And then you won't have to be wondering. You'll have the information right there, and nobody will be able to say, well, obviously the most common label for all the people who aren't men or women is blah blah blah, without looking at this document, because like they could be immediately, what are the words? Yeah, nobody would be able to make an assertion about what was generally accepted or the most popular of anything, because as soon as they look at the document, they would find out whether they were right or wrong, and then they can just update their knowledge of things and start being more accurate.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
so it was probably about then that I discovered that spreadsheets were extremely exciting. And yeah, so I put this survey on my personal Twitter, and people started responding and retweeting, and I put it on Tumblr as well, and people were reblogging it. And I ran it for like maybe a couple of weeks. I can't even remember how long it was now. It was not very long. And it got like 2,000 responses. And I was like, this is the most attention anything I've ever done has ever gotten. Actually, no,
Mhm.
that is a lie, because I did a webcomic and that got a bit of attention as well. But anyway,
Mm.
it was the most attention that I had managed to get in a while, and it had just sort of happened accidentally and unexpectedly. And I was like, well, this is great. So I blogged the responses. I made a lot of graphs, put little descriptions. When people had written things in text boxes that I thought were interesting, I put little quotes in. And basically, I had managed to pin down like what the most commonly used language was by and for people in this very diverse group of people. And it could be used as a reference, but it was only 2,000 people. I say only, it's quite a lot, but like for
Mhm.
something on the internet, I mean, obviously there's a lot more than 2,000 non-binary people on the internet, and it would have only rippled out to like a few degrees of separation from me. So a lot of these people, I was thinking, are going to be people probably more similar to me than a lot of other non-binary people would be. And at the time, the most popular gender label was genderqueer. So,
Mm.
and the second most popular was non-binary. So I was like, okay, I'll call it the genderqueer non-binary census. No, the genderqueer non-binary survey. Yeah, I'll call it the genderqueer non-binary survey. And about a year and a half later, I was like, I wonder if like anything has changed. Like have any identity words or pronouns like gotten more popular or less popular? Like,
Mhm.
do pronouns go through fashions? You know, like a couple of decades ago, Z here was like pretty popular, but like maybe there's another one that's climbing the ranks and overtaking or something. And I was getting a bit excited about like maybe I could find out if there's any trends in this stuff. So
Mhm.
a year and a half later, I just did the same survey again, but like I made a few improvements to the wording of the questions, and like somebody had recommended some documentation from the Equality and Human Rights Commission about, you know, the wording, how to word gender identity questions that would exclude the
Mm.
fewest people and be really open.
Mhm.
And I guess I probably added questions and took questions away and did the same survey again, and it got more people. And so I was like, okay, great. I'm going to maybe think about doing this on a regular basis. And I sort of accidentally started doing it every year because, like, after quite predictably, a year after doing a survey, I started getting a kind of a hankering to do another survey and play with spreadsheets again.
Addicted. You're
Yeah,
addicted.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like a really, really, really slow addiction, a once a year hit addiction. So yeah, I just started running the survey every year, and every year it got more participants. And I was very aware that once a year for like a month or two, I was being extremely annoying to all the people on my personal Twitter account. So I decided to like make a Twitter account for the gender census, and along the way, I took out various biasing factors. Like I changed the name of the survey from the genderqueer non-binary survey to the gender census, because if it's called genderqueer non-binary, then anybody who isn't genderqueer or non-binary is going to see the title and be like, oh, that's not for me, and just close the tab.
Mm.
And the
Mhm.
year that I had updated the name of the survey to be more inclusive and less biased towards genderqueer and non-binary people, both of those identity words were chosen less often in the identity question. So that kind of reassured me that I'd done the right thing because more different kinds of people were joining in. And then
Mhm.
after that, it's been fairly consistent, actually. Yeah, so it got its own like web presence, and for a while the website was just a Tumblr blog, and then last year I shifted it so that it was on its own website, and all the reports were arranged very tidily on a
Mhm.
nice results page. And just
Mm.
every year it sort of grows a little bit and evolves into its own fully fledged thing.
Mm.
And the whole time I just feel very, very aware that I have never had any formal training. I've never done any kind of statistics education. I've never, like, the highest qualification I've got is like a couple of A levels. So I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just making it up as I go along. But every year the survey gets better, and I get better at thinking about the data and working out what I need to do to make it fair and less biased and more inclusive and more comfortable to fill in.
Maybe all the education you need is the experience.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Maybe that's the best education you can get for this kind of thing, you
yeah.
know?
It makes me think about my partner, Avery, is a big nerd, and he's like really expertly knowledgeable about moss, right?
Right?
And like
Yeah.
it is amazing because you go for a walk with him and you're like, "What's that moss?" And he knows exactly what it is. He knows the Latin name. He will tell you all about it. It's very, like why it's called, what it's called, all of this stuff. It's really great. I love it so
Amazing.
much. And but
Yeah.
he's never studied it formally. But he
Mhm.
he is he is more expert than a lot of people who have, like
Right.
just from being really passionate and excited about something.
Yes.
And like he even went to the extent of like buying a microscope so that he could look at moss under the microscope for fun, you know? Like
Yeah.
what a nerd. I love him.
Right?
So that's essentially what I'm doing, but about
Mm.
gender and with
Yeah, yeah.
surveys. And I really love that I'm getting this really broad and yet detailed, in-depth knowledge about a topic that really interests me. I'm getting
Mm.
longitudinal data that a lot of formal academic studies are probably not able to get or not funded to get. And I'm
Mhm.
able, because I'm just a random person on the internet, I can make all of it public so that anybody can use it. So
Mhm.
there's nothing exclusive about it. If I wanted to get it published in a journal, then the barriers for me doing so would be very high because I'm not in academia. Like, it would be probably
Mhm.
expensive. I would have no idea how to present it in a way that would make it suitable to be in a journal.
Mhm.
But because it's not my career, it's just something I'm really excited about. I can just put it all online in a way that anybody can read and understand. Anybody can download the spreadsheets and process the data and do whatever they want with it. And I just really love that anybody who's as excited about it as me can just download anything and do whatever they want with the data and find out anything they
Mm.
want, you know?
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
can't remember how this question started. I hope I answered the question.
Oh, absolutely. I'm trying to think what the question was as well, actually. I think I just asked you how you got into doing it. So,
Oh, wow. That was so
yeah,
long
yeah.
ago.
Right.
It's like 20,
It was
25
a good
minutes.
journey, though. It was a good journey.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
how many responses are you expecting this year? Do you have an
Well,
idea?
it's at about 39,000 so far, and we're just under halfway through. I would say, like, maybe if there's a couple of big surges from like big name queers online, we might make it to 45,000, but I'm probably expecting more like 42, 43,000, something like that.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm, amazing. I thought you were gonna say more, actually, because you said you're about halfway through.
Yeah.
Um,
No, it starts
yeah,
off with like the curve of,
peak.
of responses is really steep at the beginning, and then it sort of levels out around
Mhm.
like day 10, and it slows down a lot,
Okay.
you know.
Yeah. So what would you say is the most interesting thing you've learned from doing this all these years?
Oh man, it's all so interesting, and it's so equally interesting. That's such a hard question.
If there are more things, you're welcome to share more things.
Oh man, how long have you got?
Absolutely.
Um,
I've got all night.
I
And
find it
there's a
really.
cat, so it's all good. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. She's waiting for dinner. Yeah, so I'm very interested in how the text box entries, right? In every question, there's like an other text box for you to type anything you want. In the first
Mhm.
question, which is about identity words like non-binary, genderqueer, man, woman, there are 5 text boxes that you can write anything you want. And I add something to the checkbox list the next year if it gets entered by over 1% of participants this year. So last year, the word lesbian was typed in by over 1% of participants. And normally, I would assume that that was because they had misunderstood the question, because the question is worded so that it doesn't actually mention gender. You just kind of
Mm.
gather from the context of the checkboxes that it is a question about gender.
Mhm.
So sometimes you get somebody who's read the wording of the question, like, what words do you feel best describe you? And they check a load of the boxes for various gender identities. And then in the text boxes, they'll put stuff like pianist or scientist or like angry or tired or something like that, like
Right.
a very wide variety of really interesting personality characteristics.
Mm.
And I love those as well. But sometimes people type in like words for sexual orientation, and I just assume that they have misunderstood the question and they think that it's more broad than it actually is. But last year, over 1% of participants typed in the word lesbian, and so many of them put in brackets afterwards something along the lines of, yes, as a gender identity, or yes, lesbian is my gender, that I realized that, enough people were describing their gender identity as lesbian that I had to add it to the checkbox list.
Mm.
So I have this rule that if you add a word to the checkbox list, if there's any other words that are very closely connected to it in some way, like a direct opposite or something like that, then you have to add that one as well, like for fairness,
Mm.
and in order to be able to compare them. So this year I added lesbian and gay, as gender identities to the checkbox list. And I just think it's really interesting how there is actually a lot more overlap between gender identity and sexual orientation than most
Mm.
people will really acknowledge. Like, sort of like the trans community script on that issue is something like sexual orientation is who you sleep with and gender identity is who you go to sleep as, or something like that.
Mhm.
But it's
To go to bed at, like, who you go to bed with
yeah,
versus who you go to bed as. That's what I heard.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like the more that I do this survey and the more textbooks entries that I read and get really fascinated by, and the more that I think about it all, like the more that I realize there is a lot more overlap between sexual orientation and gender identity than a lot of trans people will let on to the cisgender group, if that makes sense. Like, people don't
Mm.
really want to admit that because there's a lot of fear about, like, oh, trans women are just gay men who like to wear dresses, or some of that rubbish. So there's a lot of like separating the two, keeping them really separate. Like, you're born this way, and who you want to sleep with is one thing, and
Mm.
how you identify is this other completely separate thing. But actually, in reality, when you talk to enough trans people, you do start to realize that they're much more interconnected than at first they
Mm.
seem to be. And I think that's really cool.
That's really interesting, because in a way, it's all part of someone's identity. They're all facets of identity, I suppose.
Yeah,
Yeah. So how
absolutely.
can you separate them?
Yeah,
Like, even what you were just saying, like being autistic, how can you separate that from your identity? Because that's who you
yeah,
are and that's what you know, and you
yeah,
don't know any different, right? So,
absolutely. Like, every single part of who I am is autism flavored because I am autistic. Like, there is no part of me that isn't autistic. And yeah, like,
mhm,
for lesbians, like, their whole experience of their gender is shaped by being a lesbian, to the extent that they want to say that in a survey about gender identity. And I just think that's really interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Wow. What else comes to mind?
Hmm.
Something that you've learned that you found interesting?
Well, yeah, so people talk about experiences of gender outside of the restrictive binary of, like, you're either male or female all the time, solely, completely. They talk about it as being a spectrum, and it's quite difficult to really understand how true that is until, well, for me it was very difficult to really fully understand what that means until I had read tens of thousands of accounts from people whose genders do not fit this restrictive binary.
Mhm,
So, in addition to there being a lot of grey area in between male and female, where there's like a lot of crossover, there's also a lot of gender experiences outside of that. And there's a lot of experiences of genders that are not binary that overlap with being cisgender. So
mm,
I get a lot of people taking part who identify as cisgender men who cross dress. So they will select cisgender and man on the check boxes, and then in the text boxes they will write things like crossdresser.
mhm,
And to begin with, I was I had to really think about whether they were the target of the survey. Like, should I delete
mhm,
these because they're cisgender men? Like, they're clearly binary. They're clearly men all the time. But
mhm,
actually, like, the more that I do it, the more I realize that in order to get a full picture of, like, the broadness of gender experiences that aren't binary, I have to include people that what are the right words for this? I have to risk having responses from binary and cisgender participants in order to capture the nuance of the people on the edges, like in the margins, in the overlap areas, because those areas are really interesting, and a lot of those people don't really feel like they fit anywhere, like not even in the non-binary community. And sometimes a lot of them feel really ashamed about that. And
Mm.
when you run an anonymous survey about something as intimate and fundamental as gender, and then you put a feedback box at the end, the anonymity kind of gives people the space to talk about things that they would not necessarily talk about
Mhm.
most of the time. So you get to hear a lot of accounts from people who feel a lot of shame about who they are.
Mhm.
And a lot of those stories are from people, a lot of those stories are the ones that I find the most interesting.
Mhm.
And the more I read of those kinds of stories, the more I want to be like, yes, please be included in this really vast group of really interesting people, because like you clearly belong, you know, you have experiences that are very familiar to so many of us.
Mhm.
So yeah, like one of the groups of people that I've had to consider whether or not they belong in the sample of
Mhm.
participants is gender critical women, because
Mhm.
they reject a lot of the time in the survey, they reject labels like cisgender because they feel like it's insulting, or that they shouldn't have to identify with something that they didn't choose, or because they feel like they're just normal, you know, like I'm a normal person. The trans people are the
Mhm.
weirdos. And yeah, the way they think about gender and sex is very different from the way most trans people think about gender and sex. So they answer the question about gender identity in a way that's quite different from the way most trans people would. Like they don't, a lot of them say that they are genderless, like they check the box that says genderless, and then they also check the box that says woman. And I was very confused about this for a while until I
Mhm.
worked out from a lot of text box entries and like reading stuff on Twitter that they consider their sex to be woman. Like the label woman is dictated by their anatomy essentially.
Mhm.
And yeah, because they all were saying that they were answering the identity question with words like woman, and they were saying that their pronouns were she, and they were saying that their title was Miss or Ms or Mrs. And a lot of the time in text box entries for the identity question, they were putting female. So
Mhm.
for a few years, I was really seriously thinking, like, do these, regardless of whether or not they're putting a bunch of horrible abuse into the feedback box, do they belong? Like, if a gender critical woman came to this survey and behaved like impeccably in terms of she wasn't insulting, she didn't dismiss all transgender people as narcissists or delusional or anything like that, like if she just spoke about her own personal experiences of being failed by the gender binary, would a woman like that belong in the sample of participants of the gender census? And I concluded actually she probably would belong,
Mhm.
because a lot of these women are queer. A lot of them have felt like they feel like the gender binary has failed them, and
Mhm.
or they feel like they have failed at womanhood.
Wow. Mm.
So that's like an experience that very clearly defies the gender binary. Do you know what I mean? Like if the gender
Mm.
binary was objectively accurate, then every person would feel comfortable in either the male box or the female box. And here was a whole group of women who were happy to be happy to be considered women and still felt that the gender binary had failed them.
Mm.
So I had to create a policy for the gender census to lay out the conditions under which gender critical women's submissions would be kept in the survey. So it's essentially like, as long as you don't make generalizations about trans people, as long as you don't say that sex is immutable, as long as you don't hurl a load of abuse at me for encouraging all of these vulnerable young people into transition, stuff like that. Like if you just
Mm.
talk about your own personal experiences, and your own language preferences, then I will keep your submission in the survey and it will be taken into account. And still, like, as far as I can tell, the majority of entries from gender critical women are abusive and I do have to remove them. And sometimes it kind of breaks my heart to take the entries out because
Mm.
they write stories into the text boxes that are like really emotional, moving, relatable stories about soul destroying gender dysphoria that they've experienced since puberty, where they
Wow.
felt really wrong having breasts and wanted to cut them off, and they hated
Mm.
that people treated them like women, and
Mm.
they they hated that they were restricted by these gender roles, and they wanted to rage against society for dictating who they should be. And some of them even are like detransitioners, who have transitioned and then concluded that actually they are women and they want to be seen as women again and that they want to transition back to womanhood.
Mm.
And those stories are really moving as well.
Mm.
And then they will end their story in the feedback box with something really offensive like, and that's why I'm definitely a woman, and all transgender people are delusional narcissists, and transition should be banned, and,
Mm.
like
Mm.
just a bunch of really transphobic stuff. So I have to remove their submission. And I kind of don't want to because, like,
Mm.
it's very clear that aside from hurling a load of abuse at me, they do belong, like our stories are very similar. I relate to everything that they've said. If they hadn't put a bunch of offensive stuff on the end, I probably wouldn't have looked at it twice, because for every gender critical woman who tells me about the pain that she's gone through on the way to accepting her body, and other people calling her she and things like that, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of non-binary people typing the same stories into the feedback boxes.
Mm.
And it's like all of these people going through very similar experiences, but coming to a different conclusion about their
Mm.
gender identities feels like an important thing to acknowledge,
Mm.
study, maybe, at the very least, hear, listen to. Like, these are
Mm.
women on the margins of the margins, like women being a marginalized group. They're on the edges of womanhood. Their experiences of womanhood are are not usually accepted. They usually get a lot of abuse because of the views that they hold, or because of the way they look, or
Mm.
just for being true to themselves and who they are. They get a lot of flack, and that's all stuff that non-binary people can relate to.
Mm.
So yeah, as far as I can tell, it's in the very blurry overlap between cisgender and transgender, or cisgender and non-binary, and they've come to the conclusion that they are women who were born female, and yet they still belong and have had experiences of gender that are not binary.
Mm.
And I just think that's really interesting.
Wow, it is, yeah. Yeah, I mean, two of the words that stood out for me when you were saying all that, one was the shame, and the other one was, or the other words were like failing at womanhood.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I mean, that's something that I think a lot of, well, women and people in general can actually relate to when it comes to we're all expected to conform and fit in to this patriarchal, view of, and societal view of like, this is what a woman should be like. And if you're not conforming or, raising to these standards, then you're basically a failure. And there's a lot of conditioning in society for like, for everyone really.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting insight. Wow. Yeah. And I find it amazing in a way that really we're all on, we're all, okay, not all of us, but like, the people you mentioned in your example, and then gender non-conforming people, I mean, we're all on the same team really, but we're fighting amongst ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's missing the point. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, yeah, I've really learned that if with an anonymous survey, you can't have a conversation with somebody And that kind of sucks in a way because I want to ask questions and I want to really get to the bottom of like how people feel and why they describe themselves the way that they do. And I don't have that option with an anonymous survey, but it does kind of give me the gift of forcing me to just listen.
Mm-hmm.
And when I am in that space of just reading thousands of responses from people who have really unique experiences that kind of overlap and relate to each other's experiences.
Yeah.
Huge group of people who, no, there's no two experiences the same, but everybody has something that they can relate to in everyone else's stories.
Mm.
Yeah, and like, so why do we fight so much as a community?
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, just it would be way better if everybody just kind of went, wow, that's a really cool, interesting story about your gender and or sexual orientation. And then we could all just be like, yeah, we're all weird together. That would be fine. Like,
Yeah,
I don't think
exactly.
anybody's goals are in opposition or anything, you know?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and it's some of the stuff that they do think is an opposition. I don't quite get it. What is it that they say? I don't know. Is it about erasing women or something? I'm like,
Yeah,
how is that even a thing? How does someone who identifies or is trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming, does that make me not a woman anymore? Is that what does that have to do with it? I just don't get it.
yeah.
You know, I
I
just
don't
don't
know.
understand it. Yeah, there you
I
go.
think it's all going to become clear. Like, we're right in the thick of it at the moment, you know? Like,
Hmm.
there's so much anger from the trans side and the gender critical side just being flung at each other. And then
Hmm.
there's all the cisgender people like in the middle who are not really paying that much attention to it, I imagine, and just
Hmm.
completely oblivious to what's going on around them. I think in a few years, hopefully things will settle down and we'll be able to look back on it and put it in perspective and it might make more sense. I
Hmm.
hope.
I hope so too. Yeah. We'll have to wait and see, I guess. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add? Is there anything we haven't talked about yet that you'd like to speak about?
Yeah, so like on Patreon where you can back somebody's project for like $1, but their monthly income can be like a few $1,000s from like a lot of people just pledging
Mm.
$1, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's generally called a microtransaction, I think. And
Mm.
I think that activism can be like that too. Like every single trans friendly thing, every single non-binary thing that I see like in the wild, like a mix or a non-binary on a form from the government or anything like that, is there because somebody somewhere did something relatively small,
Mm.
like maybe somebody wrote to a website or an organization to be like, can you add mixed to your list of titles, please? Because I'm non-binary and I can't use any of the titles that are on your form at the moment. And then
Mhm.
the organization adds mixed to the title box, like one time in five. And very gradually, all of those small actions snowball and accumulate, and society as a whole just starts to normalize trans people and non binary genders.
Mm.
So it kind of happens behind the scenes, like the very small incremental changes build up and up and up and up until one day we're going to turn around and be like, well, why haven't the government allowed us to put X on passports? Because literally every form I go to on the government website has mix on it. So, like,
Mm.
why can't they just update the passports? It seems absurd. So, yeah, it's just going to sort of build up and up and up until there's a critical mass. And suddenly everybody will be like, well, obviously we should have legal recognition of non binary genders because everybody knows they exist. Everybody knows they're real. Why haven't they got rights yet? Come on. you
Mm.
know?
Right. Yeah.
And all
Yeah.
of this happens from tiny changes so that
Mm.
the background stuff that just filters into your brain like as you go about your life, like ordering stuff on Amazon or going to the doctors and filling in a form for whatever, or like going to a restaurant and finding that they've made their toilets gender neutral, like many, many small changes, microactivisms.
Mm.
That's not a word.
It
Yeah,
is now.
thank you.
It should be. It should be a word. Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of people maybe think that it doesn't matter or they can't make a difference.
Mm,
But it's kind of like with voting, it does make a difference, you know?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I've got a history book about like trans history in Britain. It's a really good and interesting
Mhm.
book, and the reason that I bought it is because the author wanted to put me in the book and needed to get my consent first. And
Mhm.
I thought like, oh, maybe it's to do with the gender census or some kind of really big thing that I've done. But it wasn't. It was about
Mhm.
way back when I had first come out as non-binary and I wanted to get a deed poll document. And I found out that you could put titles on deed poll documents, and that the main deed poll document business in the UK had drop down boxes for titles, and there wasn't a gender neutral option. So I just emailed
Mm.
the deed poll people, and I was like, "Can you add a gender neutral title to your form?" Because there's a lot of
Mhm.
non-binary people out there who are transitioning and changing their names. Maybe they might want to have a gender neutral title on their deed poll so that people can't argue that the title isn't real, like it would really legitimize the gender neutral title for non-binary
Mhm.
people as a whole, make life a lot easier. If it's on a deed poll, nobody can argue with it.
Mm.
And at first they were like, well, we're going to go think about it. And then they kind of wandered off for a bit. And then 3 months
Mhm.
later, I emailed them again, like, have you been thinking about this? Have you come to any conclusions? And they were like, oh, hang on, we're just going to go and talk about this again and get back to you. And like a week later, they got back to me and they said, yeah, there is a need for a gender neutral title in the world.
Mhm.
We've had a look at the options. We've decided that mix is quite a good one. So we're going to put mix on our form. Thanks for bringing this to our attention. And
Mm.
that's what the author of the trans history book wanted to put into the history book. They wanted to put that
How
one
amazing.
small change, you know?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
like every change like that is a very, very small change. And I feel like I've done so many huge things that were so much more work than that, you know?
Yeah.
But this one
Right.
thing that was just, I sent a couple of emails and
Mhm.
a website changed its form, and that was considered a tipping point,
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
and I didn't know that that's how it would be seen until years later when this person was writing this history book. So,
Mm.
yeah, basically just send people emails asking them to update their forms online and just do that as often as you feel like it. And it'll work
Mhm.
one time in five or whatever. And then eventually you'll be in a history book. That's my conclusion.
Amazing. Yeah, I think a lot of the time people think big things take big actions, but that
Mm,
doesn't is not necessarily the case. So yeah,
yeah, absolutely. You
yeah,
never know
totally.
when the smallest
Yeah,
action is going to have the biggest impact.
exactly.
And
Yeah,
there is no action too small.
yeah. Wow. Is there anything else you'd like to add about the census?
I do
Mm.
I, I do really like that because I mean it's not very scientific or academic or anything like that, but just the sheer number of people involved means that it is actually quite
Mm.
broadly applicable for many situations. So yeah.
And it's a unique perspective, and I mean, no one else is doing it. You know,
Yeah.
academics galore, but like if they're not doing this, then they're not doing it, and there's no results. You're doing it,
Yeah.
right?
Like if there was somebody who had a scientific or statistical background and had all the right training and knew how to use all the relevant software and all of that stuff, if they wanted to take over my survey and start doing it like properly, then I would
Yeah.
gladly just give them the Twitter account and the Tumblr account and the website and everything. I'd just be like, yeah, take
Mm.
over, do it really properly. And then all the data will be super reliable. People will be able to use it in even more contexts. It will be great.
You might
Just
want to
like,
write some small print for that though, or maybe
yeah,
stay on
like
as a consulting role. Just
just
make sure you've got yeah.
just to make sure that they don't make the results like paywalled or anything. Because
Yeah,
like
yeah, there's that. Yeah.
That's my
And the
main.
bias, people's bias, it also depends
Yeah,
on their, yeah, that's a
yeah, that's
thing.
a good point. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, the
Well, you
number
can
of
think that
academic
through
studies.
when someone offers you fame and fortune for it all.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, the number of academic studies I've done where it's very clear that, like, it's a survey about trans people, and it's very clear that they were not expecting any trans people to take part. Like,
Hmm.
a question like, how many trans people do you know? It's like, well, I am a trans person. Like, they just completely oblivious to the fact that trans people exist on the same plane of existence as they do. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? So,
Mm.
yeah, making sure that academic stuff can't be biased is really important.
Mm.
Having a
Mm.
trans person just read through your survey and be like, "What? No, this doesn't make sense."
Mm.
Um, yeah.
There are some new developments this year with regards to gender identity in the 2021 census. Kit Rackley, one of our podcast guests, wrote an article about it recently that they mention you in. Do you have any thoughts on that?
The UK 2021 census, not the gender census, still has a question on sex. The same question that it has always been. It's a compulsory question. There are two options, male or female. In addition to that, there's going to be two optional questions. One is going to be about if your gender identity is different from the one you were assigned at birth, what is it? Write it in these boxes. And
Mm-hmm.
one is how would you describe your sexual orientation, kind of thing. And both of
Mm.
those questions are optional and very open ended and helpful
Mm.
and good for queer and trans people. So, yes.
Yeah, I find myself still thinking about that first question you asked. It's like, if you look inside, what do you find with regards to gender? I'm like, wait, what? I'm still thinking about it.
It's a question that I want to ask a lot more people, actually, because, like,
Yeah.
obviously in the gender census, I ask like tens of thousands of people to look inside and tell me what they find about their gender, but like,
Mm.
I don't ask them in those words. Maybe,
You know what? Maybe add that. Yeah, or
yeah,
put
like
something in there. Like,
I
yeah.
do. I do occasionally like add one-off questions just
Mm.
to find out if it's something I want to ask about in the future, or like to just get
Mm.
like a one-off snapshot of
Mm.
how everybody feels about this one particular thing. And
Mm.
like, yeah, something I want to ask a lot of people is, when you look inside yourself for your gender identity, what do you find? And I think
Mm.
probably a lot of people would say that they don't find anything.
See, that's right. And those words are what makes it so interesting
Yeah.
because they're really simple, but are very profound. And
Yeah.
it's like, wait a minute, there's nothing there. Oh my God, what
Yeah.
does it mean?
So then it's like, how do you know what you are?
Yeah.
Like, if you can't find anything, but you know
Hmm.
that you're a man, how? And then I think a lot of people probably then would say, well, I know I'm a man because I have a penis.
Yeah, it's all about biology, isn't it? Like anatomy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there are so many trans men who don't have penises, who would also not be able to find manhood if they looked inside themselves. If they looked inside themselves for their gender, they wouldn't find anything either.
Mm.
So
Mm.
how do they know that they're men when they don't have typically male bodily configurations?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Right.
It's like the closer you
Yeah.
look, the blurrier it gets. You know, it's like
Yeah.
those paintings that are made of dots, and when you're standing far away, it looks like a picture, and then the
Mm.
closer you get, it just turns into a big sea of dots.
Yep.
That's what gender is, a big
That's
sea of
it.
dots.
I love it.
Yeah, it's so interesting,
Yeah,
right?
it is. It is.
It's
Amazing.
quite a good out of context quote, isn't
Yeah,
it? Like, that's what
it
gender is, a
is.
sea of dots.
That's it.
Yeah, just that on
You're
its own.
genius.
Cool.
You have solved gender. Okay. Well, I would like to say thank you for talking to me about all this. It's been
Oh,
really, really fascinating. I'm like, whoa.
thank you for being interested.
Processing.
I mean, I'm so interested myself. So when somebody else is interested too, I'm like, yes, let's talk about it so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm into it. So yeah, thanks for being excited about it with me.
Yay. You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Cassian, where you can also read the transcript, and you can find out more about the Gender Census on gendercensus.com and on Twitter at Gender Census. You can still take part until March 10th at least. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com and on social media. If you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Plans start from only $1 a month. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender for more details. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open-minded.
And my cat is playing with everything on the desk. Yeah, get out of there. Nothing like anyone else's. Hi, Rosa. Maybe I should just go feed her. Would it be okay if I take a short break to go and feed my cat?
Absolutely. Yeah, please do.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm back.
Okay. I was just looking at my messages and my friend just sent me a picture of her cat, so that's fun.
Aww.
Oh, all the cats.
Good friend.
Oh, good friend, yes.